So today we're looking at the poem Broom Hall, a poem by Cao Qingguanyu which is located and tied to a very specific place, and indeed a very specific time. This is a great poem, and it's one of those that has really grown on me. The more I read it, the more I found there to be a very fascinating tension and complexity at the heart of the poem, which has got no easy resolution. So to begin with, let's listen to the poet himself reading the poem, performing the poem, and also providing some interesting context about what inspired its creation.
I mentioned that I would go back a little bit, and so this is me going back. This is a poem called Broom Hall. Broom Hall is an area of Sheffield where I lived as an undergraduate. In Sheffield, not Broom Hall. I lived very near to it. But Broom Hall was fun because it was where I would go to have nostalgic moments, mostly around the purchasing of certain kinds of food, which hadn't caught on in other districts of Sheffield, particularly the student districts, which had loads of kind of organic vegetable shops, which were great, but didn't have stuff I wanted, some of which had never been involved in any natural process or so. I really love drinks that are purple and blue. Broom Hall. In light of what my aunt calls the Arabic texture of my hair, an abdi outside the only shop selling tamarind balls, Irish moss, super malt in decent quantities. It is not enough to say I miss the smell of cassava roasted over open coals, expeditions in want of tilapia, kapenta, assorted meats of questionable provenance. How much, auntie? Barter and bluff and rough hands of stall holders glazed to a deep blue, shameless blackness that is consigned now to another life before this one, of middle-class white boys in reggae bands who loved roots and culture as if their love is enough to know the code that some of us live and die by. At least these boys who call me Abdi seem to be fond of Abdi. They ask why I don't come round no more, what it's like in Leeds. And maybe today I can be Abdi, and this shop can be all the home I need.
Okay, so let's look at the poem itself. Now, as always, the purpose of this isn't to dissect it and find every single poetic technique. There's going to be a lot here that I don't talk about. What we're trying to do is develop an understanding of the poem and a foundation on which you can build your own interpretation. And as always, if you hear something that you disagree with, feel free to leave a comment and tell me how you understood this poem differently, because I think it's a fascinating poem and it taps into lots of different ideas, and I'm not going to suggest that I'm an expert on them, on all of them, or perhaps on any of them. So always feel free to share your ideas in the comments. Now, I think it will be easy to skip over how this poem begins, but let's just pause on that for 1 second. In light of what my aunt calls the Arabic texture of my hair. So this is a poem that's tied to a very specific time and place, but it begins with something else. It begins with an intimate memory, a family shared memory that sounds like perhaps some sort of teasing or perhaps not even teasing, just something, one of those comments that a family member makes. I think this is really important for the poem because it sort of sets a few ideas instantly into action. It makes us think about a few key themes. So the first one is the question of family, an idea of belonging is the first thing that we're told about. And secondly, we have this question of his hair. In previous videos, I've talked about hair and how hair is something which is a key element of racial identity. And especially when it comes to Black identity, one's hair is very important. So these first couple of lines introduce the idea of identity and the way that identity is attributed to the quality of the speaker's hair. Now, we also get this mention of the Arabic texture and a connection to an Arabic identity. And this is going to be really important, and we'll talk more about that later. In light of what my aunt calls the Arabic texture of my hair, I'm Abdi outside the only shop selling, and then we get a list of products that the shop's selling. Okay, so immediately here, we have the poet saying, I'm Abdi, and this is worth pausing on for a second. Typically, with poetry, we have the poet who wrote the poem and we have the speaker, and we use the speaker as a sort of imagined persona to separate the poet from what they've created. And sometimes this is really necessary. Now, in the case of this poem, as we're going to see, there are a lot of details that correlate with Caio Cingogni's life. So we may consider this poem to be somewhat autobiographical. However, we now get him saying, I'm Abdi. Do we think that this means that then the speaker of the poem is Abdi? Well, probably not, right? Because when you are somebody, you don't feel the need to declare that you are that person. So something's happening with this line, I'm Abdi. It feels somewhat performative. It reminds me of perhaps when you're doing a small play or role playing, you might assign characters and say, well, I'm the knight and you're the princess or whatever. So in a way, we already get this idea that the speaker of the poem is assuming the role of Abdi, is assuming the position of Abdi. And I think this performative quality of this phrase, I'm Abdi, raises questions of, performance and identity and authenticity, which as the poem develops become really interesting. So what does it mean to actually be who you are? I think that's actually one of the key questions that Cingogni is asking with his poem. We'll discuss the name Abdi in a bit more detail towards the end of the video, but the poet is assuming the name Abdi, and he is standing outside the only shop selling tamarind balls, Irish moss, and supermalt in decent quantities. We get a selection of mass-produced products that are associated with Afro-Caribbean communities. So tamarind balls, Irish moss, and supermalt. And it's interesting here to note how the capitalization of the names Irish moss and supermalt attracts our attention to the fact that these are products. These are mass-produced by companies. And even the tamarind balls, perhaps there's a suggestion that they're fresh, but there seems to be this idea that they're pre-made. Now, we're going to think about that as the poem goes on and how that correlates or contrasts with other foodstuffs that feature in the poems. But note here that the poet himself said that he used to visit these shops because he had very specific tastes. As the poet himself says, there's something artificial about them, which is part of their appeal. But this question of artificiality and, again, authenticity is something to think about as we go on. So we're outside a shop that sells these products, but where exactly are we? Well, Cingogni himself explains that we're in Broom Hall, as the title of the poem suggests. Broom Hall is an area of Sheffield where Cingogni studied at university, where he did his undergraduate degree. And in many ways, it is representative of a number of communities, especially in the Midlands and the north of England.
Broom Hall moved here in the 92. I remember a massive Jamaican community here, really buzzing with life, really joyous moments. Firstly, we'd go on, Warncliffe Road, and then go on to Brunswick Road, I think it is. And then from there we'd go to the Yasmin shop, and then from Yasmin's we'd go to Yaffai's, and Yaffai's to Broom Hall Centre, and then we went up Broom Spring Lane, where the phone box is, where some young people are congregated. There's a lot of love here, a lot of good people here.
So, as that clip mentions, and that clip is a reflection of an immigrant and his experience as he moved to Broom Hall, it mentioned a number of places where they would typically spend their time, and one of them was a food supermarket. Now, if we go and look for global foods in the area, Broom Hall, Sheffield, we arrive at this exact place that the video mentions. And as you can see here, the shop very proudly declares that it's the first shop in Sheffield owned by a Yemeni family, and we can see the stickers in the window of all the different flags of all the different cultures and communities that the shop caters for. But it's also worth noting that this is a small shop, right? This might be the exact shop that Caio Cingogni is writing about, and if it's not, it's probably one very similar to it. These are small establishments that essentially import food products that are difficult or impossible to get hold of in larger supermarkets, or indeed in the sort of gentrified areas that Cingogni wittily refers to in his introduction to the poem. So we have a really good idea of where we are in this first stanza, but look and pay more attention here. He's outside the only shop. the only shop that sells these products in decent quantities. And then what we get is a full stop at the end of the stanza. Now, we refer to that as an end-stopped line, and it creates a sort of finality. Now, as we will see, this isn't the same for all stanzas in the poem, so it's something important and something that we can analyse. But what feeling do you get from this first stanza? It's worth reflecting on, because I certainly feel like there is this sense that the poet creates a sort of feeling of isolation. The fact that he is outside the shop and not inside it suggests that he's in this sort of in-between space. And that's really important, actually, as a metaphor for what the poem explores. And the fact it's the only shop that sells these products in decent quantities, it does give this sense of incompleteness. There's this lacking in the poet's life. And this is a place that, on the one hand, allows him to buy these products, but it also, I think, in this moment where the poet is sort of stopping and thinking about things, as we will see in the other stanzas, it draws our attention to what is lacking, okay, because it's the only place that has them in decent quantities. So pay attention to the way that the poet creates tone and atmosphere, and I think he does that very effectively by placing the character outside the shop and by using this end-stopped line to give a real sense of finality and pause for thought. And indeed, there is a real pause for thought, because what happens next is we go from the time and place of the moment, and we seem to go on a journey through the poet's memory and through the poet's thoughts. So the second stanza begins, "It is not enough to say, I miss." And then we get the things that the poet misses. Now, that's a fascinating line, and I think it's really important. Don't skip over that. The poet here is saying, it's not enough to say that I miss these things. And again, we get this feeling of incompleteness and this feeling of dissatisfaction. There is a longing here. The poet longs for things, and he realizes that it's not enough to say that he longs for it. It's not enough to say that he misses these things. That doesn't take away the possible pain that he feels for this longing. And also what perhaps this line does is refer to the poem itself. Perhaps he's almost being self-referential. A poet can only ever say things. That's the only tool that's available to the poet, and it's a very powerful one. At its core, just saying he misses things doesn't resolve anything, and it's almost as if it's not possible to put into words exactly what is being missed here. So you can think that this line is quite self-referential, or it could just be expressing the enormity of the feelings that he has. So what is it that the poet is missing so much? Well, it's the smell of cassava roasted over open coals, expeditions in want of tilapia, capenta, and assorted meats of questionable provenance. So what we get here is another list of foodstuffs. What do you notice about the food listed in stanza 2 compared to the food listed in stanza 1? I think that's an interesting question. First of all, what do we get? We get fresh food, okay? We get cassava roasting, and we get fish that are being actively sort of hunted or fished for. These are fresh items of food that have to go and be caught or have to be prepared, which contrasts with the pre-packaged, pre-made products that are available for sale inside the shop that he is outside of. Notice here how the freshness of these items is brought to life by the use of imagery. We get the smell of cassava roasting over open coals. The details gives us this vivid image of what it is he can remember. And that's really important compared to the somewhat cold listing of brand names of the super malt and of the Irish moss in the first stanza. There is a big difference here between listing brand names and listing the authentic words, names that are used to describe these fish. I mean, capenta in particular, if you do some research about capenta, you will find that it's a fish that's very commonly associated with Zambia. So this is the poet really connecting with his Zambian heritage, and maybe these are memories that come from his time being in Zambia. And this is why I say that this poem is somewhat, it seems to be very autobiographical, because we know that Kayode Ncigonyi himself is a British Zambian. These foods are connected to genuine memories that he has of home, and home is a complicated and complex word to discuss, and this poem definitely discusses that as well. But these are specific food items that he associates with memories. And a specific Zambian identity he has, which again contrasts with the products that are listed in stanza 1, which are sort of, in fact, they're more Caribbean than African, you might say. Okay, super malt is a sort of associated mostly with Nigeria, But it seems that in many ways, the food that he buys at this shop is a sort of compromise to what the authentic things that he really wants, the actual objects of his longing. These are just sort of substitutes in a way for what he really wants. And the idea of being a substitute is quite an interesting one. The idea of compromising is quite interesting. Again, thinking about Abdi and the way that he's substituting his identity for that of this name of Abdi. More of that to come. What we get at the end of this stanza is the use of enjambment. So instead of having an end-stopped line like in stanza 1, we go straight into stanza 3. I think sometimes people struggle to talk about this and analyse it in much detail, and it does feel strange at first, but I think it's important to think about why the poet has written it in this way. And I think each instant and each poet does it for different reasons. What I feel here is what we get is that stanzas 2, 3 and 4 seem to sort of blend together into this journey through the poet's memory. What this one does in particular is it makes us pause on this phrase, the meats of questionable provenance. The poet is obviously pointing out that perhaps when he was in Zambia or when he was at home, he would eat meats, and this idea that instead of being pre-packaged and neat and like you'd buy at Tesco's or whatever, this is meat that is, we're not really sure where it comes from or if it's all cut from the same animal, and there's this sort of beautiful, chaotic, organic energy going on here with these assorted meats. But notice how it makes us pause on the word provenance, which is the beginning of the next stanza, and then we get that full stop, which is a form of caesura. We pause after the word provenance. Why would the poet want us to think about this word provenance? What does the word provenance mean? Well, really, it gets to the heart of the poem, which is thinking about the origin, the source, the history of ownership of a valued object or work of art or literature. And it seems to me that the poet wants us to think about provenance because this is a poem about essentially him thinking, where do I come from? Where do I belong? And I think belonging is an even more evocative idea in this sense. So I think this use of the word provenance is an opportunity for the poet to just very discreetly draw our attention to what's actually going on here. Where do these things come from? It's not just talking about the meat. I think the poet himself is thinking about what is my provenance? And how does that have an impact on my identity? Our journey through the memories continues, and we get this sudden switch here, which is noted by the use of italics when you see this published. How much, auntie? And it's this lovely transition into a sort of another type of shopping experience. And we seem to go to a sort of market environment. This phrase here, how much, auntie? Who is this auntie? Well, it's not the aunt that's mentioned in the first line of the poem. I'm fairly sure of that. What this appears to be is the speaker remembering how he would communicate with shopkeepers and stall holders in these markets, asking how much something costs, how much, auntie. And many cultures refer to strangers, especially strangers who are older than you, as uncle and auntie, even if you don't know them at all. If we look at this fantastic bit of research that is done by Onur Solmaz on his blog, he's looked at the world where people refer to non-relatives as uncle and auntie, and he's produced this map. And as you can see, across Africa and Asia, they're at what he refers to as level 3, which is when total strangers are referred to as uncle and auntie, used even for someone you've just met, a shopkeeper, taxi driver, or older passerby. So this is essentially a common term of endearment, which is typical of where he is from, or at least where he feels like his heritage is from. And the use of colloquial language here really adds something to the poem. It adds a texture to his memory, and it feels like what he's saying here is he's not just missing the food itself. It's everything that comes with the food. It's also this feeling of intimacy and belonging and closeness with the people who sell the food to him. How much does it contrast, this how much, auntie, and the images that it conjures with what we see in the first stanza of the poet standing outside a small shop? Okay, one is sort of cold and screams of isolation and incompleteness, while the other one is about belonging and intimacy, the idea of a complete stranger who is just selling you some fish or some meat, being family. So food shopping becomes an act of community as opposed to just a cold transaction. So this mention of food and then this fragment of dialogue from the act of shopping itself takes us into another quite ambiguous but beautiful moment of the poem. And notice here how the poet begins to use some sound devices, which perhaps reflect how impassioned he is becoming on this topic. We get the alliterative barter and bluff, and then we get these sort of internal rhymes, bluff and rough. And then we get the assonance of stallholders glazed to a deep blue, shameless blackness. So these memories and these experiences via these sound devices pull us into a sort of stream of consciousness reflection on what this represents. Because this isn't just about food, it's about what food represents in terms of identity. And this gets to, I think, the heart of this poem. Barter and bluff and rough hands of stallholders glazed to a deep blue, shameless blackness. Okay, so first of all, this seems to be a recollection of the sort of marketplace environment. And notice that the image that's used by the poet is of the rough hands of the stallholders. Now, that's quite an interesting image to choose because it's one that has connotations of hard work and a difficult life. The poet isn't trying to romanticize what he sees as perhaps his home or perhaps another place where he would feel more belonging. He has a good idea of what life's like there, but nevertheless there's something raw and authentic about it that he just hasn't got here. And that's also reflected in this phrase, the deep blue, shameless blackness. Now to me this is a fascinating line of the poem because it's somewhat ambiguous and difficult to understand. What we certainly get is this powerful two words, which in many ways are parallels of each other, the shameless blackness. So his memories are of a place where his blackness is also shameless. But shameless is such a slippery word. Shameless, obviously, on the one hand, means to be without shame. So a place where he hasn't got to feel ashamed of his blackness. But I also feel like shameless has an implication that there should be shame, which is why I find it such a difficult word to understand in this context. And I'd love to hear your ideas. We often say someone is shameless when they don't seem to be feeling shame, but they should be. So what feeling exactly is Kayo Chingonyi finding here in the heart of his memory of perhaps Zambia, perhaps a marketplace in Zambia? But it certainly feels like a certain place of authenticity where he can be himself. And I think that's the important thing to take away here. Another question we get is why the mention of the colour deep blue? When I think of deep blue, and the first thing that sprung to my mind, and I think this is important, is the sort of colour of tarpaulin that you typically see at sort of street side markets and food markets, especially in hot countries where you have to really block out the sun if you want to sell anything fresh. So I think of that deep blue colour and I think of tarpaulin and I think of perhaps it's sort of a fragment of a memory. And I think the deepness of the blue is also important, right? It's as if this memory has some depth. This place has some depth. And by implication, his life in England, his life in Broomhall, Sheffield, perhaps is a sort of shallow existence. So this is a really fascinating part of the poem, and it's hard to understand because in many ways the syntax breaks down. So the syntax, meaning the way that the words are organized to make sort of sense, to make grammatical sense or to make sense of the situation. In this moment, it does break down a little bit. Look, it says barter and bluff. Okay, so barter and bluff, we could see as sort of two verbs. And then, and rough hands of stallholders. Okay, so we've slipped there from verbs of bartering and bluffing to an image, a noun of rough hands of stallholders, glazed to a deep blue shameless blackness. Okay, so are they the rough hands that are glazed? The stallholders themselves are glazed? And what does glazed mean here? Is it their expression? Does it refer to a physical quality they have? Is it their appearance? This moment in the poem raises a lot of questions. And I think that's intentional. It feels like we're getting access to a memory that the poet has that is almost made up of these fragments and these images. It seems to be breaking down a little bit because it's not referring to one specific moment. It's referring to a sort of feeling or a quality that life in Zambia has that is certainly missing from his life in England. And to really consolidate that, we get this final line that all of these memories, all of these images are now consigned to another life. Now, these words really carry emotional weight because to consign something is so final. There's something so certain about consigning. And actually, when we think of consigned goods, we think of things being moved or sent somewhere else, like through the post or shipped somewhere. They're a consignment, which is actually quite ironic when you think about what we began with was this discussion of food products that have almost certainly been consigned from the Caribbean or from Africa to England. He's now thinking about how memories have been consigned to another life somewhere else. So the poet brings our attention to both the geographical distance here, but also some other distance between his current identity and a seeming authentic identity which is out there but just out of reach. Now, in another video, I'm going to talk about Kumukande as a collection because this is all about this feeling of not having access to a part of one's identity. So this is actually interacting with some of the key themes of Kumukande as a collection. We get another use of enjambment and we go into stanza 4, where we move from that previous life, from another life in Africa, perhaps in Zambia, to the current one. And what do we find in this current life? Well, we get this phrase here, middle-class white boys in reggae bands. Middle-class white boys in reggae bands, I think, brings up a conversation about cultural appropriation. And there's a lot on the internet, there's a lot of discussion about what cultural appropriation is, and I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on this at all. And I also think it's important when we're discussing cultural appropriation that we discuss it in the context of this poem. But I think the cultural appropriation is really obvious here. The middle-class white boys are enjoying a certain part of immigrant culture, in this case reggae, which is hugely popular in the UK and that was brought to the UK by Caribbean communities that immigrated. And, you know, we think about the Windrush generation and there's lots of interesting information available online about that. But in the context of this poem, in the context of what we've read so far, what we immediately realise is that these middle-class white boys don't pay the same cost that immigrants pay. We get these intimate feelings of the pain and longing that the poet, the speaker feels. And then we get this juxtaposition with the middle-class white boys playing reggae. And we can see immediately that they don't really pay the same cost that the people whose culture that represents are paying. And what it centres around is this idea of roots and culture. And Kauchi Ngonyi has very intentionally chosen this phrase here because roots and culture is an allusion to Jamaican reggae culture. This is something that comes up a lot, and it's something that's mentioned by reggae artists as a way of reminding people to stay connected to where they come from, to stay connected either to their roots in Jamaica or stay connected to sort of humble beginnings and not lose contact of the culture.
Know about your roots and your culture. Yes, you will fade out forever. Live good in your neighborhood. Live good and live good as you should. Shabba ranking you a murder. It is music, me charge.
So we get two songs there, one from Mickey Dread and the other one from Shabba Ranks, which both in very different ways talk about roots and culture. They're both entitled Roots and Culture, and they're both about staying connected to where you come from. Now just think of how jarring it must be to see people, in this case middle-class white boys, but in truth could be anyone, talking about roots and culture, but not actually having any roots or having any connection to that culture other than a certain love and appreciation for it. And this is why I said it's important that we be careful when we talk about cultural appropriation, because the poet is not denying that they love this culture, that they have a certain love for playing reggae or for what Jamaican culture has brought here. So this isn't an attempt to gatekeep or say that some people can't like or enjoy certain things. He's pointing out the stark contrast between the difficulties of belonging to an immigrant culture and how this longing and pain can suddenly come to you in a moment as banal as doing some shopping. And when given this context, we can appreciate how jarring it can be for those who do not belong to this community to come and in many ways exploit this identity for their own benefit. In this case, the phrase roots and culture literally being something that describes the attempt to stay connected to the place where you're from. And again, thinking about the emotional journey that this poem goes on, we then here get some more sound devices. We get internal rhymes, or at the least a use of assonance. Love is enough to know the code that some of us live and die by. So the use of internal rhymes here adds a certain emotional weight to these words. And you notice as well that with the exception of enough, these are all monosyllabic. Love is enough to know the code that some of us live and die by. There seems to be a real anger behind these words, and I think the quality of them being monosyllabic makes them feel like they're almost being spat out in disgust to a certain extent. If not in disgust, at least in indignation. So the emotional impact here is actually within the techniques being used by Chingonyi, not just within the content of the words themselves. And finally, we end the stanza with an end-stopped line, which we haven't seen since the first stanza. And it feels like this is the end point of a series of thoughts that he's had as he's standing outside the shop, okay? So the first stanza, he's outside the shop, and then stanzas 2, 3, and 4 seem to be, like I described earlier, a stream of consciousness reflection on what does this whole experience mean, and why do I suddenly have these feelings of longing for something, and why am I feeling this way? And these are all the reasons. We get the memories, the specific references to the food, the memories of the market, and then the anger that comes with seeing how immigrant identities, even an identity that he doesn't belong to himself, remember, he, as this poem suggests, belongs to a sort of Zambian identity, but he can see in the way that Caribbean and specifically Jamaican reggae culture is exploited a certain injustice, and he feels a sort of anger, which is an important part of the emotional journey of this poem. So the end point of this stream of consciousness, of these thoughts and memories, is that he and others live and die by this code, this feeling of longing. It becomes part of who they are. They belong to a culture, and yet they have this feeling of not belonging, of disembowelment, because it's always at a distance and it's always somewhat out of reach. And now, if I'm honest, I think this live and die by a code is somewhat cliched, but it's definitely powerful at this part. And this full stop really brings us back to the moment. We're back almost outside the shop. I can very easily imagine how this poem could be imagined visually as a sort of scene or a short film, as we then zoom back and we are standing outside the shop in Broom Hall, Sheffield. And what's going on outside this shop? Well, we actually make a very interesting discovery here, because the poet tells us in the first stanza that he is Abdi, but actually he's being called Abdi by a group of boys. These boys who call me Abdi seem to be fond of Abdi. So what's actually going on here? Because this is very different from what we originally thought that was going on, and the poet chose to not tell us immediately that he's being called Abdi. He told us that at first he was calling himself Abdi, or he was assuming the role of Abdi. Let's start with the name itself. Abdi is an Arabic name that translates literally to servant or even slave, and I think for this reason it's been the subject of some debate within Arabic-speaking communities in terms of its use as a name, although it is a very common name, and it is particularly common within Somali communities. Now, it should be pointed out that I have tried to do my research about this, but there's not an awful lot out there, so if you have more information, please put these things in the comments. From what I found is that particularly in Somali communities, the name Abdi is very common, so it can be commonly used. Men who belong to the Somali diaspora would refer to each other as Abdi almost assumingly. And furthermore, Broom Hall is actually a place that has a very large Somali community, so that would actually make sense. So when the final stanza begins, at least these boys who call me Abdi seem to be fond of Abdi, I think what's happening here is these are Somali boys who see the poet as sort of one of them or a member of their community, and so extend the name Abdi to him, which would make sense because they seem to be fond of Abdi, of course. Or alternatively, these are boys from different cultures and different communities who are wrongly identifying the poet to also being Somali. Either way, the poet makes it clear to us that he's not Abdi, but he doesn't mind this too much, seemingly doesn't mind this too much. Notice that the word these does quite a lot of heavy lifting here. These is a demonstrative adjective. Now, this experience seems to be a friendly one, but by specifying these boys, it draws our attention to perhaps other boys or other people who use names in a much, much more menacing and destructive way. It also draws our attention back to the middle-class white boys. I mean, the word boys itself gets repeated, so we inevitably draw a comparison with the middle-class white boys in the reggae band in the earlier stanza. Chingonyi is delicately pointing to the racism present in society, but instead of it being front and center, it feels like it's constantly there in the background. These boys seem to be fond of Abdi. There are others who aren't as much at all. But they're not spoken about. And they're not actually the subject of this poem, although it is important to think why the poet included that feature. So the poet is happy to be Abdi because these people seem to like Abdi. But just notice there's a really sad irony going on there, that he is happy to be liked for someone who he isn't. Okay, this isn't who he is, but he doesn't mind continuing with this performance because it gives him something. Now, what does the name Abdi give the poet here that perhaps he's lacking? Well, within the name Abdi, we get a sense of warmth and friendliness, and above all, even a sense of belonging. So Abdi is almost a persona that the speaker can perform as and feel like he belongs. And notice something else here in this final stanza, that the speaker now lives in Leeds, and I believe that Chingonyi also did for a short while live in Leeds, so this is another autobiographical detail. And the boys notice his absence. So in many ways, again, the poet is returning to another life in this poem. He's returning back to Leeds, somewhere where he no longer lives. So there are layers and layers of absence and longing going on in this poem, Broom Hall. We know that he no longer belongs to Broom Hall, the same way perhaps he no longer belongs to Zambia. And this temporary visit can only offer him a temporary feeling of belonging. And the idea of belonging, as you can tell by how many times I've mentioned it, is really key to this poem. Notice how Chingonyi is representing so many different black identities and how many of them are present in the poem. We have the sort of East African Somali presence through the name Abdi and possibly through these boys. We also get the Zambian traditions in his memories that represent sort of Southern Africa. And then we also have the influence of Caribbean and the Jamaican through the reggae music, through the products that are on sale in the supermarket, which also references a more Afro-Caribbean or West African identity. There are so many different black identities, and there's a certain slippage going on between all of them. And all these expressions of black British experience and identity are located and focused in this place, this humble food shop that sells products from around the world to these communities. And these identities are forced in many ways to occupy one space. And so I think we can think of the shop in Broom Hall as a metaphor. And it's a metaphor for the experience that Chingonyi is trying to communicate. It's a feeling of not belonging, but also within this shared experience of not belonging, there is a sort of identity that's being constructed through that. And we see that in the camaraderie between these boys and the name Abdi, and the poet's willingness to sort of play along with that or to assume that persona. And this is one of the reasons why I said this poem really grew on me, is because there's actually something really complicated going on here about the question of identity. And I think if you approach this poem from the question of where do you think the poet feels like he belongs, I think that's a really complex question, and it'll be far too simplistic to say this is just him going to the shops and thinking about Zambia and thinking about a memory. It's so much more than that. And I think the name Abdi and the use of the name Abdi and this sort of character persona that's being created is key to unlocking that. And we see that towards the end of the poem with this closing idea. Notice here, maybe today I can be Abdi. So the use of commas, and again, caesura here, it highlights a certain uncertainty. We can't read this without pausing. Maybe today, and the fact that it's the word today here suggests that if this is a solution to his problem, to his longing, that he can pretend to be Abdi, it's at best a solution that is temporary. It's only going to really last the day. And notice how Chingonyi reverts back to monosyllabic words for the majority of the final two lines of the poem. I can be Abdi, and this shop can be all the home I need. I think this is something that Chingonyi does very effectively, is use quite plain and simple words to express more complex ideas. It's almost this final moment of the poem is breaking everything down into its most simplistic expression. And notice here how the word home is saved until the final line of the poem, which is fascinating really, because we're thinking about identity, we're thinking about places and spaces and where we feel like we belong. Home is naturally what we're talking about. But the poet suppresses using that word until that final line, and we're told that he does need home. Okay? He does feel like he needs a home. The structuring of those final sentences does not make sense unless the speaker of the poem feels a need to have a home somewhere. So maybe the fact the word home comes so late in the poem suggests how this is a feeling that's being suppressed or repressed by him. And it's only here at the very end, after having processed his feelings, that he can sort of accept that he needs to feel home somewhere. It's something that's lacking in his life. So this return to Abdi in the final stanza, after being the first thing that we hear of at the beginning of the poem, again creates a sort of cyclical structure. And it's not uncommon for poems to end up where they began, in a sort of cyclical structure. As I've mentioned in another video, cyclical structures generally tends to make us reflect on how much has changed or how much hasn't changed. So what do you think has happened by the end of this poem, by this return to being Abdi, and how much we've learned in the meantime of what this really represents? Do you think this is a hopeful ending? Do you think this sense of camaraderie and friendliness is actually a possible outlet for him to construct a new identity in which he feels safe and comfortable and like he belongs? Or does this whole interaction, does this whole experience actually half conceal the truth that he feels he'll never be at home, that he'll never truly belong? I think how you see the ending of this poem, and whether you think it's a hopeful and optimistic ending or one that's quite pessimistic, will shape how you see the poem Broom Hall as a whole. And if I'm perfectly honest, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think what's wonderfully complex about this poem is that it can be both sort of hopeful whilst also expressing a deep sadness and loss for something that he'll never quite belong to, something that is consigned to another life. Okay, so that's been my feelings of Broom Hall as a poem, and like I said, it was quite light on poetic techniques and quite heavy on meaning, because I think this is quite a deep poem in many ways, but it's also quite gorgeous, and the way that it discusses the complexities of immigrant identities through experiences and through images is really fascinating. I also find the slippage or the blurring between different expressions of Black immigrant identity to be really fascinating, and the humble international food shop that you'll find in so many towns and cities in the UK becomes a symbol for where all these complexities are brought into sharp focus. And again, I have to go back to it. This all happens without him ever stepping foot inside the shop. What kind of poem would Broom Hall be if he actually went into the shop, instead of always standing at the periphery, always standing in the margins, always standing outside the shop? I love this metaphor of the shop and the space, the symbolic space that it represents. So the structure of the poem works really nicely, and the use of enjambment and end-stopped lines with stanzas needs to be noticed. The first and last stanzas and how they're end-stopped really capture this feeling of being isolated or excluded from something, of being outside something, whether it's outside a shop or outside a more genuine or authentic identity, like the one that's consigned to another life in Zambia. And then the three stanzas in the middle and how they flow together through the use of enjambment seem to create this stream of consciousness experience, and all these memories and ideas, they flow into one another. And speaking of flowing into one another, I think it's important to reflect on how this poem is also an emotional journey. We begin with just this very matter-of-fact description of a trip to a shop, and we go through all these different emotions, whether it's longing, whether it's anger, whether it's denial, and so on. And now, this may seem a little bit crazy, just an idea to end on, but there is a very influential theory on grief, which is called the 5 stages of grief, or the Kubler-Ross model. And it suggests that when we lose someone, especially a loved one, we go through 5 stages of grief. We go through denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally, acceptance. Now, some of these align quite nicely with these, especially like stanza 3 being bargaining, and we actually get a memory of him bargaining and bluffing and bartering in a shop. That seems to perhaps just be a coincidence, but that seems to align quite nicely. And I'm not suggesting that Chingonyi wrote this poem to reflect the 5 stages of grief, but it does make me think, and I find it quite interesting to think about, is this poem a sort of grief? Is he accepting that a certain part of him has now died? Another way of thinking about death is going on to another life. And that's the exact terminology, that's the exact phrasing that he used to discuss his life in Zambia and the thing that he misses so much that he can't put into words. So again, I'm not suggesting that this poem is written to reflect the Kubler-Ross model. If you want to believe that, you can do. Perhaps it is just a coincidence. I'm only mentioning that here to reflect on the emotional journey that Chingonyi has gone on in Broom Hall and to make us think about what is being processed here. What is the poet trying to work through in Broom Hall? There is something missing to his identity, or there's this feeling of longing or this feeling of lacking. And that's what makes Broom Hall such a fantastic and rich poem, and it speaks directly to what Kumukanda as a collection is all about: cultural identity and the question of belonging. I hope you enjoyed Broom Hall. Go back, read it again. It's definitely worth the time to study. More Kayo Chingonyi poetry to follow.